All right, Andrew, you think you're ready to get started?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to GIS Day, session 2. This is for examples of GIS in the private sector. For those of you who signed up for other ones, this morning we had the Mass GIS. Later at 4, we have GIS use in DCR in the bird harassment program. And then tomorrow at 10 a.m. we actually have MAPC, which is our Metro West Planning Commission, doing an overview of their use of GIS and public resources. So I would like to thank Andrew Gorman here today from Beals and Thomas. I have known Andrew for about 5 years. He was on the Conservation Commission in the previous town that I worked with, and he was my chair for a while. So I'm very excited for him to be here and give this presentation. He has a great deal of experience that he has dedicated a lot of time to learning, and he is such a great resource. So I'm very thankful that he'll bring this kind of private sector view to the public, because maybe not all boards might be seeing permits and applications, but this is very relevant in today's day and time, especially for me and a lot of other permitting boards, and the work and effort that goes into a lot of these plans and wetland delineations. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrew. And again, for who might not have heard before, feel free to go in the chat or the Q&A or raise your hand if you have a question. If it's relevant during, I'll try and peep into Andrew. If not, there will be kind of a catch-all at the end. So go right ahead.
All right, well, excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa Danza and the Southborough Conservation Commission for inviting Beals and Thomas to present today for the GIS Day celebration. We're going to go over some examples of geographic information systems in the private sector, specifically samples of things that we've worked on in the past and how we might use the GIS for project planning. So we're kind of going to jump right in. I'll give you a quick overview of Beals and Thomas. For over 35 years, we've been providing professional services that support the development and conservation of land and water resources throughout New England. We specialize in civil engineering, landscape architecture, land surveying, environmental planning, permitting, and wetlands consulting. So we provided this slide not so much for marketing, but to kind of show the lenses through which we engage with GIS, whether it's from a civil engineering perspective and project planning, whether it's from a community planning perspective, or if we're gathering resources to get ready for a wetland delineation, all of which I think we'll see samples of today in this presentation. The organization of the presentation, we're going to go through some examples of trail mapping that we've done with municipalities, using GIS for MVP, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. We'll go over a little bit of how we use GIS to inform project planning from a civil engineering perspective before we start making design choices. And then we'll go through a little bit of a thorough field investigation of how we use LiDAR to plan and prepare for wetland delineations. Community planning and trail mapping, highlights from past MVP planning workshops and trail mapping. So the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program is a way for communities to engage with climate resiliency planning, and many towns and cities have pursued certification in this program, both for planning purposes, but also to position themselves well for grant funding through programs like the MVP itself, as well as FEMA. One portion of the MVP process is the Community Resiliency Building Workshop. And in these workshops, stakeholders from various groups in the communities are invited to discuss natural hazards that are known and may be facing the community, and also discuss potential strengths, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses, various attributes of the town that may be known. So one of the ways we engage with GIS in this MVP planning process is preparing base maps for the Community Resiliency Building Workshop. At this stage, the base maps are put on various tables for individual groups to interact with. The larger group and the stakeholders in the Community Resiliency Building Workshops are broken up into these smaller groups. And once in the smaller groups, these groups have the opportunity to actually write on and reference and comment on the base maps that are prepared. We have a sample of one of these base maps for the town of Seekonk here on the left of the slide, which shows some major features like the FEMA flood hazard layers, both the 100 and 500-year floodplain. Major streams are shown, the fire department. We show major structures like the town hall. So it puts some information in context that's ready available to the public. However, one of the things that I typically or especially enjoy about this process is that you get that local level of engagement with this geospatial data. I'll show an example of that in the next slide. So this is the lower part of the map from the town of Seekonk. It's from one of our groups at the stakeholder meeting. For instance, we show here the FEMA flood layers in blue and in orange. But we also have a group member who noted that there's a low weight bridge. So in this community planning exercise, we can start discussing things like what does it mean for a low weight capacity bridge or a low bearing capacity to be in a flood zone, to be in a highly trafficked area? What are the natural hazards and what are the ways that we can improve resiliency? On the other part of the picture, we have an example where some community members noted that everybody within this general vicinity is using an on-site septic system rather than connected to the town or city wastewater. So it helps kind of blend that local knowledge with the larger geospatial information that we put together in the planning process. And then we'll further beyond the community resiliency building workshop, we're also generating various base maps. Here's some examples from Seekonk as well. On the left, we have some maps that were prepared using US Census data related to population. And on the right, we have another map that includes that FEMA flood layer that we mentioned before, the 100-year floodplain, but it also is showing things like large building structures that were recorded in GIS and in this maroon color. So one of the triumphs of the MVP program is that it really prompts consultants and stakeholders to put these information in conversation with one another so we can make informed decisions in the planning process. All right, so we're gonna go to some open space planning and how we use GIS. In the past, Beals and Thomas has worked with various communities to engage with open space planning, whether it's for a conservation management plan or something like trail mapping, which we are seeing here. It's an opportunity to combine field data collection and visual representation techniques in GIS. An example of how we accomplish this, we use a handheld GPS unit to collect data points along existing trails. These GPS points were then imported into ArcMap, or you could use whatever GIS software you're most familiar with and connected to represent a trail network, basically creating a shapefile with our GPS data. So this data is then combined with a base map and other GIS layers to represent landscape features. For instance, here we have shown the Mass DEP wetlands layer. We have some structures and streets shown. We have also some LiDAR data incorporated, which we'll get to later in the presentation to show some elevation. So things like this are a really unique opportunity to focus on aesthetic choices in presenting geospatial data for recreational use. And so this was the Wittenberg Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts, and we'll see one more slide of that here. This is the Cochituate Brook Reservation in Framingham as well. Again, same technique, using GPS data collection to subsequently portray the network of trails, and then incorporating other GIS-based data available through Mass GIS to prepare the whole package. All right, project planning, taking a structured approach to reviewing geospatial data for planning. So from a civil engineering perspective, which is Beals and Thomas, we're a consultant. We work on a lot of various projects, and at the project planning stage, we feel it's really important to have a well-structured approach in how we incorporate GIS when we're planning these projects. What is a well-structured approach? This could include having a very thorough base file that references many different GIS layers. It's key for us to understand what layers have regulatory and design implications. These could include things that gesture towards regulations or things that clearly delineate important areas that have land use restrictions. Some layers we have to also approach with an understanding that are comprehensive or not so. So a layer may gesture towards some archaeological information, but we might also need to know that additional information is required. So in doing this, not only are we setting up a strong base file with a lot of GIS layers incorporated, we're also putting together GIS checklists for project managers who know that their whatever design is going to encounter. If it's a coastal project, we need certain layers shown. If it's going to have stormwater design, we know we're going to need to show layers that relate to zone 2s, cold water fisheries, things that would trigger different review standards when we go to design infiltration basins, for instance. And we have a note that having a structured approach, whether it's through a checklist, through a base map, but some level of accountability at the outset, it provides that accountability and prevents sort of that casual browsing approach of relying on interactions with MassGIS Oliver for long-term planning and permitting choices. And deploying things like a GIS checklist or creating a base map at the get-go of a project using GIS, we're creating that record of engagement where if a regulator asks us down the road, have you interacted or have you reviewed the natural heritage priority habitat layer, we're able to kind of retrieve that swiftly and show how the breakdown of that information relates to project sites. So we have a sample of the natural heritage layer here shown, which was redelineated in 2017. So another slide showing some more of the GIS checklist that we use. These layers particularly have implications for stormwater design. Back when I served on my conservation commission, I can't even say how many examples we have of engineers coming before us, and after several thousands of dollars of design work, when we get the Mass DEP technical review comments, it is found that the project is discharging to the watershed of a cold water fishery. And all of a sudden the basins have to either be retrofitted or redesigned in some way to meet those additional storage standards. So it's really key for us to know what layers have regulatory weight. In this case, the Drinking Water Standards, the Wetlands Protection Act, and know to bring those into the project planning step very early. So next, we're going to talk about how we've used GIS in the past for vegetative management. Beals and Thomas has worked with various communities, including the City of Worcester, the Department of Public Works and Parks, to evaluate the presence of vegetation growing along various ponds. The specific examples here are Hadwin Park and Elm Park, where we've recently undertaken a field review of vegetative conditions along the bank to help discern whether or not invasive species were growing, whether it was clusters of native species, and what can be done about it. What are the management options? So this blends an interpretation of aerial photography from MassGIS to help us approximate the extent and type of herbaceous growth along the banks of the pond. So it's both a field botanical exercise and an exercise in looking at the aerial photographs to see through time how have these vegetative clusters changed. So for the purpose of this exercise, we relied on aerial photograph interpretation, but as we list here on the bottom bullet, there are different layers of precision that can be added. If it were more than just an investigative exercise, we can incorporate GPS location or even survey data and then subsequently portray that in our GIS files to more accurately map the extent of vegetation. But for this exercise, it was more of what's out there, what can we do about it? And we relied on aerial photograph interpretation. So we'll have one more slide looking at those. Here at Elm Park, we're looking at Phragmites australis, an invasive species, and how this translated in the map product that we subsequently produced. In the legend, we can see that we were mapping not specifically the individual species, but giving the city a sense of percent cover of invasive to native species. What was the relative abundance that we observed in the field in this area, and how did it correlate to how these species were being seen in the aerial photography. All right, so now we will talk about some field applications of using GIS, anticipating specifically microtopography with LiDAR to assist in wetland delineation planning. Just for a little bit of background, a wetland delineation is something that establishes the physical boundary of a wetland in the field pursuant to federal and state regulations. And historically, prior to the start of field work, wetland delineators are engaging with a suite of geospatial data, which includes USGS topographic maps, NRCS web soil surveys, Mass DEP wetland GIS layers. Historically, those of us that do pursue wetland delineation have already been engaging with various geospatial information. So as defined in regulations, wetlands are delineated based on three things: plant communities, hydrology, and the presence of hydric soils. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on hydric soils and see how LiDAR can help us make some assumptions prior to jumping into the field. So presumptions of hydric soil formation. This is a quote from Jim Tureen of New England Soils. He says that the most important factor for hydric soil formation is landscape position. The first thing we learn about hydrology is that water moves downhill. Hydric soils are most often found in depressions, along drainage ways, and on level or concave slopes. Always note landscape position when delineating hydric soils. And for a quick illustration, we have two slopes depicted here on the left of the slide. Letter A shows what we call a convexing slope. We see the arrow showing us that water is diverging away from the center of the slope. So this may be typically indicative of uplands. Again, we wouldn't know for sure until we go out in the field, but water is moving away from the center line of that slope. Whereas on the flip side, letter B shows us kind of an abbreviated version of a concave slope. Water is going to be converging at the base of the slope. So we can make some presumptions that if we are seeing concave slopes on maps, we know we have to specifically look in these areas to investigate the presence of hydric soils. So LiDAR, in GIS, what and why? LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, which is a remote sensing method. It uses light in the form of pulsed lasers to measure ranges or variable distances from satellites to the Earth. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Office of Coastal Management, they maintain a catalog of LiDAR elevation resources that are available to the public and are downloadable in a number of formats. Wetland delineators are already using, as we've established before, a suite of GIS data when planning, which includes Mass DEP layers, specifically the wetland layers, topographic maps, soil data. But adding LiDAR to this equation provides a better opportunity to characterize landscapes and their microtopography prior to visiting a site. So what we're suggesting here is that incorporating LiDAR prior to a site visit helps us better understand what we're looking at, and instead of that 10,000 foot view that we're getting from a topographic map. So let's pretend for a minute that we're wetland delineators and we want to investigate this sample property. It's a pout pond in the town of Uxbridge. We're not revealing any proprietary information. This is a conservation land with a well-known wetland system. So, but for the sake of this exercise, we're going to kind of go through some GIS information as if we were wetland delineators. On the left-hand side, we have the NRCS web soil survey map. I've kind of put it on an aerial image so we can see the area. We're looking at the area that is between the pond, so east of the pond and west of West River Road. We can see that where the arrow is pointing. We see through the soil map, it is mapped as a Scarborough and Walpole soil, so we can start to make some assumptions that there might be wetland development and hydric soils in here. It's mapped as a poorly drained soil. Looking at the USGS topographic map in the middle here, we can see that there is a depression shown. That we can understand that by the change in the contour. And we see some sort of wetland indication near the pond through the symbols being used. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, here is the Mass DEP wetlands layer that we've downloaded from Mass GIS. And the Mass DEP wetlands layer is showing some of this orange hatching here, which is indicative of a wooded swamp. So already we're thinking, when we go to this property, we're going to have to investigate these areas specifically, or we have some presumptions that there's a presence of a wetland. Now, LiDAR helps us take that a little bit further, and we'll download some LiDAR data specific to this area. This is the data access viewer from NOAA. I have the link at the top of the slide, and we'll also make this available for anybody who's interested in viewing it. And I guess one thing I will add before we get too deep in this is this elevation exercise can also be helpful to conservation commissioners or planning board members or anybody who's really involved with land use that wants to review a site's topographic complexity before actually attending the site visit, give you sort of a preview of the landscape. So on the data access viewer, we're going to click on the elevation LiDAR data. And once we get to this screen, we're going to come to a map. We can type in our location in the address, and it'll take us to where we want to go. There's a draw tool, which we've shown here in the red arrow. And once we click on the draw tool, we're able to drag a rectangle over the area in question where we want to search what LiDAR data is publicly available that we can subsequently download and manipulate to provide us with some additional information. So we've drawn our box. We found where we want to be in time and space. We are to the east of the pond, to the west of the road, a little bit north of the parking lot. And on the right-hand side, it's going to give us some options of what LiDAR data is available for us to download. For the sake of this exercise, we're going to be using the 2015 USGS data, and we'll see an example of why in just a moment. Once we've taken our data, it'll take us to a shopping cart, which gives us a number of options about how we can receive this data. It'll be delivered to us via email, but first we need to tell NOAA, the program, how we want to receive the information. And there are three key areas here for using GIS. The output product, there are a few different options. We can download this information as points, as raster files, or as contours. There are certain advantages to using points and raster files, but that's a little bit more sophisticated than I think what we're going to be trying to accomplish in reviewing for a wetland delineation. So we're going to set our output product to a contour. We want contour lines to look at. The output format for GIS, we're going to export this as a shape file. So the lines will have individual information relative to elevation stored within themselves as a shape file. And one of the reasons why we've chosen the 2015 LiDAR data that's available for Maine and Massachusetts is because we can use the 1 foot contour interval here. So we can get as precise as possible in approximating the changes in elevation at this property. So once we have this, we can click next. NOAA will send us an automated email. And once the output file is generated, we will receive another automated email with a download link to the data. And that data will stay relevant for, I think it's a period of 90 days. It may be 60, but it's either 60 or 90 days. So we've received our download from NOAA, and now we want to open our GIS program, whether we're using QGIS, another open source software, or something in the Esri line. We can pull in an aerial image to kind of get our bearings. We see the pond to the west, the road to the east, and we kind of know the area that we want to hone in on. And the project manager is asking us, how long do you think that this wetland delineation is going to take? How complex of an exercise will this be? So we could fall into a trap of just kind of looking at some numbers and measuring based on the Mass DEP wetland layer, but the LiDAR here will give us a chance to give a more intricate answer. So once we import the LiDAR data as a shapefile, it's going to look pretty raw. It's all in one color, and it's pretty unrefined, but each line here is going to have an elevation assigned to it that we can later manipulate and help understand in the delineation process. So one of the things that I like to do is change the symbology. The symbology is how the data in the shapefile is visually represented in the GIS program. And specifically for delineation purposes, I like to change the elevation to a color gradient, showing the lower lying areas in a darker green color and the higher elevation areas in red orange. So based on what we're looking at here, we can start to make some assumptions. Between the pond and the road, we seem to have a large depressed area, and there seems to be some kind of micro depressions between the pond and the wetland that may need some additional investigation. And now at our last LiDAR slide, we can also turn on labels to display elevation in relation to the data that we're using. So I have some arrows here pointed at some things that strike me as somebody who's been involved with wetland delineation. We see potential depression up here between the pond and the wetland system. We see potential what may be a stream or some kind of channelized feature connecting the pond to the wetland system. And then these last two arrows, if we go back to the previous few slides talking about convex versus concave slopes, we can start seeing slopes where water may be converging, and there's a greater potential for hydric soil formation. So anything that I'm saying here, it does not absolve the delineator, whoever's doing the field work, of the responsibility to investigate these areas, whether they've reviewed the LiDAR data or not, but it helps better position us to understand the microtopography before we step foot on a property. And so what does this look like at ground level? We have a nice little hemlock swamp where I used to hunt spotted salamanders as a conservation commissioner. So just as that final reminder, the NOAA coastal LiDAR elevation data, it's a helpful resource to approximate a site's topographic complexity prior to the start of field work, but the planning does not take the place of any field responsibilities when performing a delineation. It helps us give a more thorough answer when a project manager might be asking us, how long do you think it's going to take to get a site like this done? Obviously, you never know until you really get to the property, but it also helps us make those informed decisions about how many times am I going to have to put a shovel in the ground and look at the soil profile. So with that, it was a brief overview of some of the ways that we use GIS at Beals and Thomas, and I'm going to invite Melissa Danza to speak if we have any questions. I heard some notes from the chat.
In the chat, I just posted the two links, Access Viewer and the QGIS for anyone interested. I haven't gotten any chats. If anyone has a question, please feel free to put it in now. I know there was a lot of, I think, terms that some of us might be familiar with, and I think maybe most of you in the attendees, but if not, then, you know, feel free to reach out or raise your hand and we can address any of those questions. But otherwise, I think that was it was very informative. So thank you, Andrew. I know a lot of work goes into on the private side, you know, getting ready for applications, especially larger sites, in a myriad of ways that, you know, the private entities and consultants look at sites. It's very interesting, you know, and it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of people. And I think that's something that us on the public side may not see as much.
Thank you. And I think it is important both for regulators and for those of us in the private sector to kind of understand what resources are out there. When we're planning a project, it's important for us to know where the certified vernal pools are, where the cold water fisheries are, because these things, they have design implications, and we want to, you know, work within what the regulations will allow. And I think it's an essential tool in the project planning process, and I can't advocate for it enough. And I cannot advocate enough for using LiDAR in site visits, whether you're a conservation commissioner, agent, or wetland delineator. I strongly recommend trying to engage with the topographic complexity of a site as much as you can before setting foot.
So there was one question asking if you use any drone photography for these studies.
Oh, that would be excellent. We personally do not, but there are firms that do incorporate drones for both survey and for aero photography. I think both Melissa and I were involved in the Uxbridge Conservation Commission for a little while when a member was very invested in turning drone imagery into ortho images. And we understand that there's certainly a push for the technology going in that direction. So we don't personally use drones, but it's certainly something that's worth exploring in the future.
Yes, it's an interesting resource that's coming up more commonly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of different regulations that I think we got to figure out regarding drones as well in the meantime, but you know, we use what we can.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I don't see any other questions. If anyone has anything in the meantime, you know, feel free to either email myself or Andrew's email is up on the screen as well. And thank you all for joining us on GIS Day. I want to give you a big thanks to Andrew as well. Actually, we just got one question. I apologize. Okay. So can the GIS application be applied to a smartphone for mapping rice fields, irrigation in rural areas?
So there are a number of both open source and commercially available iPhone apps. Personally, I don't use the iPhone for geospatial data collecting, but we often find that the GPS triangulation on our iPhones is sometimes stronger than GPSs we were using a few years ago. So in terms of data gathering, one could certainly use a smartphone in that capacity. You could use a smaller end, maybe Trimble unit if you want to get a GPS. But there are many different ways you can apply GIS in this particular situation. If you're just mapping the boundaries of a field. But I would also say that there's a survey component too if we're establishing a legal boundary. And I don't want to misspeak on that end, but I'd be really fascinated to hear some elaboration on that. So if you want to shoot me an email regarding the rice fields, I'd certainly love to know more about that situation.
Perfect. Not seeing any others, but there's still time. If anyone has questions, you can use the Q&A or the chat, or you can send either of us an email. You know, even if you just have mine, I can forward it off to Andrew, no problem. And just a reminder, there are other GIS seminars today at 4 and tomorrow at 10. And if there's any other questions, you know, please reach out to us. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to Beals and Thomas for agreeing to do this presentation.
Thank you so much for the invitation. We appreciate it.
Anytime. All right, I think that might be it. So thank you all, and we will see you all soon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yep, bye.
Bye.